Hi, this is Brian Kim. I want to share with you this case of a patient who had a dislocated IOL that fell into the vitreous space. The lens was then removed by a retina specialist and then referred to me for a secondary IOL placement. And so the first point is this patient had a vitrectomy, okay? And because the patient had a vitrectomy, you're going to see how I struggle with placing the needle through the sclera. And because of that, I end up with a flagpole sign. And I'm going to show you how I deal with the flagpole sign by pulling the flange out, cutting it, and then refixating it. So what is the flagpole sign? It means after you pull the needle out and the haptic is out of the eye, the haptic is sitting straight up. It's pointed up and not flat to the sclera. If the haptic is pointed up in any which way or form and it's not flat to the sclera, that's called a flagpole sign. That means you don't have an adequate scleral shelf, and therefore the optic is going to sag or be decentered. And you're going to see this perfectly illustrated on what shouldn't happen when you're doing the Yamane technique. And so I'm holding the incision, turning irrigation on. So I'm going to go to higher mag here. Again, I'm going to grab the incision, turn irrigation on. You see I'm holding the eye in the neutral position. I'm going to stab the conjunctiva and the sclera simultaneously. Okay, I'm stabbing and then I'm flattening out. You saw that? I stab, make sure the eye is pressurized with infusion. I flatten out, I tunnel 2 millimeters, and I go vertical, perpendicular, and then I dive down. You saw the iris coming out of the wound a little bit, turn the irrigation off. So using foot pedal control to turn irrigation on and off is also very, very important. And being able to quickly turn irrigation on and off is very important with this type of surgery. So I'm going to use a 23 gauge smooth forceps here, grasping the haptic very gently, the trailing haptic, sliding it in sideways, and then sliding it into the incision. By doing it this way, it's very gentle. I flatten the haptic on the bevel of the needle, and it goes right in. Okay? Disengage the right side needle from the syringe using a hemostat, laying the needle down, and then I'm going to internalize the leading haptic and lay it into the angle. Okay, so this is the problem side, and it's going to be subtle because you can't tell. Again, this patient's been vitrectomized, so the eye is tending to be soft. And because of the angle and the forces, I'm pulling with my forceps as I'm turning the eye away from me with the needle, because as I'm pushing the needle with force, the eye is trying to rotate away from me. I thought I got a nice scleral tunnel, but I could tell and feel that there wasn't the same level of resistance throughout that 2 millimeter tunnel. I felt like I had some loss of resistance as I went. And so again, it looked good. So I went ahead and proceeded. Go ahead and grasp that leading haptic very gently with the smooth forceps. I'm flattening the haptic on the bevel of the needle. Remember, that's my technique. That's what I always recommend. Flatten the haptic on the bevel of the needle. And you saw it didn't really quite go in, so I'm going to refixate, hold it, flatten it out, and it goes right in. You can't really advance it unless it's flat, and so that's very important. So now I'm ready to go. I'm pulling both needles out just a little bit, and then I'm focused on pulling the left side needle all the way out. I have my forceps ready to grasp the haptic, and then I switch to the cautery and go ahead and cauterize the tip to create a small bulb. I do the same thing on the other side, pulling the needle away from me, making sure I'm in the same orientation in which the needle came, pulling the needle out away from me, and then very carefully just trying to grasp the haptic with the forceps. And there you go. All right, so very carefully, go ahead and cauterize the tip. All right, so look, take a look here. What do you notice? The right side looks perfect. It's flat and parallel to the limbus. If you look at the left side, it's not parallel to the limbus, and you can see the flagpole sign. You could clearly see the haptic sticking up. And lo and behold, the lens is decentered. There's no manipulation that's going to cause that lens to center, okay? I can use those forceps and yank and do all this stuff. And I really did that just to illustrate that point to y'all, that that's not going to work, okay? So what are we going to do? We're going to go ahead and do a conj cut down on the left side needle. Again, the left side needle had the flagpole sign. The haptic was sticking up, which means I didn't create an adequate scleral shelf. There's optic sag. It's tilting back, and that's why it's decentered towards the right side. I'm using Wexel sponges to keep the blood from obscuring my view. And then you saw I was able to use the 30 gauge thin wall needle to grasp the flange and pop it up. Now that I have the flange up, I'm going to go ahead and cut it. But when I cut it, you see I'm cutting the haptic a little bit sideways. And I did that on purpose to create a narrower profile of the haptic so that'll be easier to recannulate the needle. Go ahead and internalize the haptic and pop it back into the angle, and then I'm going to start all over. Okay, grasp the incision, turn on infusion, stab the conjunctiva and sclera, making sure I'm really flat. You see that? I'm really flat as I'm tunneling, really flat, and then I dive right down, let go of the incision, make sure the infusion is on, make the eye nice and firm, and then I stab. And so I felt a lot more resistance as I tunneled the needle through the sclera, and I made sure I was in a proper orientation, making sure my marks align properly. Go ahead and grasp the leading haptic. But you see, this is the technique. You want to flatten it out on the bevel, and that's the whole point in directing the bevel. I intentionally bend the needle in such a way that the bevel is going to approach the haptic, okay? So, I got a little bit hung up there, so I just said, okay, I'm going to reset. Take a deep breath, reset, and do it again. That's the nice thing about this technique. You're not in any rush. You've already fixated the right side. The lens is stable. So just take a deep breath, using irrigation to help clear my view. I had them put some water on the eye. I flattened the haptic on the bevel of the needle. I rotate the needle. Look how much rotation my needle is in such a way that I can align the needle to the haptic. Okay? So I'm turning that needle all the way, and I'm making sure I flatten the haptic on the bevel of the needle. You see, I'm right at the pupil edge. I'm just trying to make sure if I try to yank it more towards the center, I'm going to lose my alignment. So that's why I kept it at that pupillary edge. I was able to cannulate it, good to go. Because the needle holds that haptic so well, I just have to do maybe a couple of millimeters and then I'm ready to go. I'm able to pull the haptic out, grasp it with the forceps. Cauterize the tip. And then look, see, now there's no flagpole sign. It's nice and flat and parallel to the limbus. Go ahead and push the haptic flush to the sclera, and look, a beautifully centered lens. You see that? A beautifully centered lens, and not only that, it's nice and flat and planar and parallel to iris plane. So I'm done with that part. Go ahead and place a tendon-nylon suture as I always do, and then I go ahead and do some more vitrectomy. Really, there's no vitreous because the patient already had vitrectomy and a lens removal. But I'm doing this to just ensure there's no potential vitreous in the anterior chamber, but also to remove the viscoelastic. And I didn't make an incision on the right side, and I really have to because I have to make my surgical PI. I go ahead and make my incision and then perform the vitrector PI through that incision. Again, it's going to be a temporal PI. Turn the port down, making sure I don't go all the way out to the periphery. Get a nice, small, discrete surgical PI. Switch to the anterior vitrectomy setting. And then here I'm going to switch to cortex mode. Because I know there's no vitreous in here, I'm just trying to remove the viscoelastic from the anterior chamber and any viscoelastic that's also stuck to the cornea. I also like to pulse with the BSS cannula to loosen up the viscoelastic. And so at this point, you always worry that this is what's going to cause pressure problems. This patient obviously has had vitrectomy. And as long as you do the technique like this, I haven't really encountered really major pressure issues post-op day one with this technique. So again, my tenon suture is in. You saw that this patient was aphakic. I put in this lens with my technique, the trailing haptic first by externalizing the leading haptic. And you saw the lens was decentered, right? The lens was decentered, and it's because as I was tunneling the needle to the sclera, again, because the patient was vitrectomized and because of the forces, I'm pulling the incision towards me with the forceps, but I'm pushing the eye away with the needle. Because of those forces, it causes the eye to collapse. Plus, this patient's been vitrectomized. And because of that, I think it really affected my ability to get that nice, shallow scleral tunnel. And you could feel the loss of resistance as I was tunneling a little bit prematurely. As a result, I had a little bit of a flagpole sign. Flagpole sign means that the haptics tilted up because of an inadequate scleral shelf. Therefore, the optic is going to be tilted downward and sagging. And lo and behold, as I pushed the haptics flush to the sclera, the lens was decentered towards the right. So again, I had to do a conj cut down, and then using that 30 gauge thin wall needle, I was able to use the tip of it and hook the flange, pop it up, cut the flange, pull that leading haptic back into the angle, starting all over with cannulating that left side needle through the sclera. I made sure that I was nice and aligned, and I stabbed through the conjunctiva and sclera. I flattened out. I had a tunnel 2 millimeters, and I felt good resistance. And if you feel like the eye's collapsing, you really have to let go of the eye, make sure infusion is on, and I was able to keep tunneling and then dive down. And because the pupil's a little bit small, I had to rotate the needle towards the haptic, flatten the haptic on the bevel of the needle, and as I flattened it out, I was able to go ahead and thread the haptic into the needle. Again, not too much, maybe a couple of millimeters. And then as you pull the needle out, the haptic stays. It does not slip. This is so much better than the C2 Lucia lens. If you don't feed a lot of the haptic into the needle with C2 Lucia, there's a chance as you pull the needle out, you're going to lose the haptic. And I've done that. That has never happened with these lenses. Whether it's the Technis 3-piece or the Sensor, that just doesn't happen. So I'm able to confidently pull the needle out. The haptic's always there. I'm able to grasp it and then cauterize the tip. And really, this is a perfect example of how you refixate a decentered lens. But it also speaks to the fact that if you don't have an adequate scleral shelf and you encounter the flagpole sign, you are going to have a decentered lens, you're going to have a tilted lens, you're going to have a poor refractive result, you're going to probably induce some astigmatism. And that is your litmus test, the flagpole sign. So as you pull the needles out, you've cauterized the tips. And as you look at both haptics, you have to make sure, one, are the haptics flat to the sclera? And if they are, that means you have a nice scleral shelf. And then you want to make sure they're parallel, right? If they're mirror images of each other and they're flat, then you're going to get an excellent, not only excellent anatomical result, but also an excellent refractive result. So again, this is an example of how you can have a decentered lens and how you can fix that problem. Again, what causes it? It's because of an inadequate scleral shelf. Always look for the flagpole sign when you're doing these cases. There are many cases out there where I know early on people were not aware of the flagpole sign. If you look up videos now on YouTube, you'll see a lot of cases and they were not properly executed because of that flagpole sign phenomenon. Make sure you have an adequate scleral shelf when you're performing the Yamane technique, and you're going to get not only a great anatomical result, but also a great refractive result. So I hope this was helpful to you, and I thank you for your attention.